Sound Radio.
Barry, welcome. Welcome, Barry.
Thanks a million, Paul.
And
it's good to be back with bees.
Good to be back with bees. Although today the weather has suddenly changed, hasn't it?
They just stay indoors.
They just like us all.
Keep warm, eat honey. You know.
I can't blame them. Can't blame them.
No, you can't. They've not had a bad run this year.
No. It seems to come and go, and at least the children should be happy now that they're going back to school. Yeah. And the weather's changed.
You know, I brought in some honey the other day.
Yes, it was gorgeous.
It was gorgeous.
Yeah.
Well, that was honey that I'd harvested about 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
From a hive in the garden. So I just want to tell you briefly about that one hive, and they're not all like this. This is a bit of a good story. So back in the spring, the bees from that hive have been harvesting on the oilseed rape flowers, which is an early source of forage. But you have to remove the honey from oilseed before the flowers die. Otherwise, it goes too hard in the comb for the bees to forage on. It's perfectly good honey, makes great honey. So we had some of that. And then in July, I took another harvest from that colony, and it was a big harvest. I took 2.5 super boxes, about 60 pounds of honey, and that was one we had a sample from. I'd also raised queens through that colony because it was the character I wanted, and although you can't be absolutely certain genetically, it was a target hive for me. I raised queens, I had the 2 harvests, and then earlier this week I went back to the colony to try and take some of the empty boxes off, and I was absolutely flabbergasted to find it full of honey again.
Brilliant.
So I took 3.5 super boxes full of honey, another 70 pounds of honey. So I've had 150 pounds off that colony.
Your little bees have been working hard, haven't they?
And they swarmed last week.
Yes.
So I've had a colony, I've had 6 queens and 150 pounds of honey. So I was going to sort of do an accelerated life cycle through bees, brought in some bits and pieces that I might have been interested in when a very short while ago I was even more of a novice than I am now. Okay, if I just launch into this.
Just launch into it. You just get going, because we're doing a video for people who are listening. We're doing a video as well so that Barry can explain and show some things tactile.
That's the whole idea. So here is a little frame, a honeybee hive frame, but instead of having the comb in it, this frame has been adapted to raise queens. So here there's 9 cells that are going to be used for raising the queens, and I start off by putting into these little cells here the 4-day-old larva from recently laid eggs. And to do that, I use a little tool called a Chinese grafting tool that enables me to lick out the larva and then transplant it through that little plunger, transplant it into the cell. So prior to loading them with larvae, I've put this empty frame into the bees, they've cleaned the cells, they've waxed round the rims, they've given it their signature of approval. I then whip it out and I put the larva in across all 9 cells, turn it this way up, hang it in the hive, and the nurse bees will come in and feed those bees and develop them into queens, if I'm lucky. If a lot of other conditions are right in the hive, the populations and balance and things, the queen is fed all her life on royal jelly, which is a sort of a bee-sick and intense honey, and the bees exude this onto their mandible. So the bees...
Super protein, is it?
It's energy and protein.
Yeah.
It's largely energy. It's derived from nectar, but it will contain pollen as well. And they'll feed the queen this, and the queen will grow much larger as a result of this intense feed. And I'll just take one of these cages off. So the cell will be built down like this as the grub increases in size. I don't know if you can see, if I turn the thing to you, you can see maybe there's a little hole in the top of that cell. That's where the queen has emerged at some time.
They're like those little files, aren't they?
Yes.
They're like little files.
What they call them, the medical file.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So the bees have fed the queen. As the grub has grown, they've extended this wax cell, so she's a much bigger bee, and it's a much bigger cell than you would have for worker bees. There's a 16-day cycle, 16 days from laying the egg to the queen hatching. The egg stands up for 3 days, then lays down. So by observing eggs in the frames, I can see when a larva is 4 days old, and I harvest the 4-day larva, put them in to the basic cell, introduce them to the nurse bees, who start to feed them. On day 8, they cap over the bottom of the queen cell with wax, and the grub will metamorphose into an adult queen bee. What we do at some point after day 8, but before day 16, normally a couple of days before, is to trap a couple of bees into the cage and put them over the top, so that when the bee emerges, she emerges into the cage. We can then take the whole assembly, the whole cage assembly off, and transfer that to a nucleus, to a hive.
I'll tell you what they also look like with the holes like that. I was trying to remember what this struck me as.
It's
like.
Curlers.
It's curlers,
yes,
yeah.
Yeah, they
In
are.
fact, you could just use curlers, couldn't you?
You could almost. They're very, very similar to old-fashioned curlers. This has got a little gate at the top, so that when you're ready, you can release the queen into a hive, or you can plug this with a fondant, and when the queen eats her way through, I actually let her run out. So here's now a queen, and the smallest hive we have is a mating nuke, or a nucleus, from which a queen can fly, mate, and start to lay. So this is about as small as we get. It requires the smallest amount of bees, a cup full of bees, just tipped into here. I'll just take the lid off, make sure there's no bees in it first of all. And so the nucleus hive contains just 4 frames, and we start them by putting a little bit of wax onto a frame. Then the bees will build that out with comb, and here we see the start of the beeswax comb they've taken from the foundation. But it's a pretty small colony.
So you start with a little skeleton, really, and then they just...
A little piece of wax foundation that encourages the bees to follow this line. Otherwise, we'd have a wavy pattern inside. And then all of these, you can't really predict what the bees are going to do, but over a period of time, they'll gradually build that into a curve. So some of this you can see has got pollen in it from the last time it was used. But here's a little feeder. Now this feeder, we can't feed the bees sugar water here because they would drown in it, so we have to use fondant, and it takes up 2 bee spaces. So what I invented is a means of feeding the bees without the need for an internal feeder. So I can put 2 more frames in there. I'll put that back for now. And the technique is I drill a hole in the lid of the nucleus hive and fit one of these access rings. So here it's fully open, there it's on vent, here it's closed, and that particular configuration there with the stripes is a size of slot which enables the worker bees to pass through but not drones or the queen. So what I would do, once the bees are charged in there, I've put my queen cell in. So this queen is now spending a day or so getting ready, getting the pheromones merged with the other bees prior to being let loose. I can open that and I can put what's called a rapid feeder on the top. And the rapid feeder goes like that. And in here you have a container for the feed, a hole right through the centre, and a cup. So the bees come up the hole, into the cavity between the cup and the cone. That is filled with sugar water solution, and a cap goes on the top. So I can top it up without having to interfere with the bees, and it gives them more space inside the colony.
Does it ever get a yeast in there that makes it ferment or anything?
It lasts quite a while before it ferments. Now, in this type of brood chamber, they require very little in the way of food. You know, one, you're going to put half an inch in here, but instead of having to give up a quarter of the brood space, I can now use an external feeder. There is a different type of feeder, which is called a rapid feeder, which has an amount of gauze, and we'd fill this feeder with sugar water, and then I could place that over the top.
They're just old plastic containers, are they? Or
well, yeah, not
are they specially made?
Well, they are specially made, but they are just old plastic containers. This one with a gauze in it, the bees will come up and they'll sup from the gauze. The trouble is, when that's in the outside with a brick on the top or something, and the sun warms it up, through expansion of the air gap, it pushes the syrup through. So, although it would be very convenient to use that, we end up using this one, which sort of locks on like that, and that satisfies the. There's a little tooth just there, a little cone that locks on, and the bees come up and they can drink to their heart's content, take it down, convert it to baker's honey. It's not a proper honey, but it's a sort of baker's honey. So that's the principle that takes us from grafting a queen cell through the rearing of queens and the introduction of queens to a mating nuke. The importance of the mating nucleus is that with the prevalence of the Varroa destructor, there's a high incidence of male bees, drones, that are not virile. They become infected by the Varroa, and consequently mated queens mated with those drones, tend to be ineffective. They don't lay properly, or they lay what we call pygmy drones, which are male bees that haven't fully developed. So the mating nuke is a way of verifying that once the queen has mated, she comes back to lay, and we can verify that we've got a queen-right colony where the queen is laying viable brood.
And so that's all starting to take place again now, is it? Or
we're just coming to the end now. Because,
well, that's what I was just thinking.
We're just coming. That's why these are empty. We're just coming to the end of the period where you would raise queens. You wouldn't really want to try and raise a queen much after the middle of June, because the Varroa strength would have increased quite a lot by July, and the probability is that the drones available for the queen to mate with during the July, middle of July, early August would not result in viable queens. There's a considerable percentage rate that wouldn't be the case.
So they're just finishing off for the summer now?
Yeah, basically. And the queens now are in the process of declining. So, rounding that off, what I wanted to show you, where's my big bucket gone?
Behind you, it's behind you.
Behind you.
Guess what's coming up shortly? It's the pantomime season.
It is, yes.
So here, from the huge harvest I had earlier this week, are the cappings. These are the wax cappings that are cut off the side of the comb face prior to spinning the honey out. And these are all soaked in honey. They've been drained. We've got as much of them as we can, but nevertheless, it's wax cappings. And what we do is we return the cappings to the bees, and the bees will lick the honey off the cappings and return to us dry cappings that I can melt down and make candles with if I want. But here is a piece of an example of a tray which had cappings in it a couple of weeks ago, and the bees have taken all the honey from the cappings, then they've moulded these cappings into this shape. And this shape is what's called brace comb. It's an ancient structure. Bees have been doing this probably for 100 million years. It forms a number of purposes. I think in the case, slightly artificial case, where we've got a pile of crumbs, it's quite difficult for the bees to tunnel their way through and retrieve all the honey if the wax crumbs are falling in on them. So by moulding it this way, they clean it up. But it's also an instinctive process. The tin is very thin. They would feel a fragility in the tin. And so you get a situation where hundreds of bees in pitch dark, working together at various parts, will take the crumbs and mould them into this structure. And where we see the tiny holes in this structure, they're very similar to the cells that the bees use for raising brood and storing honey, but they're not for that. They are not the same structure. They are engineering structures. These various holes that you can see are stress engineering structures designed to give the optimum amount of wax, the maximum amount of rigidity and strength and bonding characteristics. Something which the bees have developed instinctively over 100 million years.
So they're really clever architects, aren't they, to get the best out of everything they do?
Well, that's a really good question, well timed, because yes, this is an instinctive product, something they've made in small groups, and as they make this, they have to raise the temperature of the wax, so they're shivering their wing muscles to create heat, to soften the wax and mould it into these shapes. And they do that instinctively. On the other end of the intelligence spectrum, the varroa mite, which is presenting such a threat to bees at the moment, this tiny mite that sits on the bee's chest, punctures the carapace, sucks the hemoglobin out.
Horrible.
The bee has got 6 legs and could go like that to flick the mite off, but it hasn't learned to do that yet. So the bee doesn't know, I've got to get rid of that. And it's up to us with our intervention procedures and pest parasite management procedures.
Will that stop them learning, though? Will that stop them learning?
I bet you in 1,000 years or so they'll have cracked it. But that's the sort of time it takes. The bee only lives 6 weeks. 3 weeks in the colony, 3 weeks foraging. It's very gradual, the learning process. So everything that they learn that's instinctive is the product of 100 million years. But there you see a brilliant example of engineering. I wonder how long it would take us with computer printing or other forms of numerically controlled machine tools to make anything like that.
It's amazing, amazing. It's only because we recognise them, because we've actually learned them ourselves, haven't we, that we can see certain structures. But when you look at cathedrals and that, it wasn't that long ago when they started to build in that way.
There's a lot of bioengineering precedent. You take the honeycomb structure itself, the innovation in the hexagon, the way that this is used in satellite ablatement structures. It's we've learned such a lot from insects.
It's clever, very clever.
Yeah. So that's my package of information. I've done some notes and I'll send you some photographs. I've brought you up to speed with where we are. We're coming to that part of the season now where the population is probably as high as it gets, but the queen is laying off laying now. She's not increasing the population anymore. The residual workers are still foraging, trying to pack in as much honey as possible. We, of course, having taken out chunks of honey, we haven't taken this from the brood chambers, we've taken it from the supers, from the extra areas, and we'll be supplementing the bees with feed so that they've got enough stores to last them through the winter. It's not just getting over Christmas. We need to get them safely into March so that when the queen starts laying again in February, heating up the hive to keep the brood warm, consuming those stores, there's enough stores there to support the bees to hit the ground running in spring with sufficient populations that they can defend themselves against various predators and pests and viruses and pathogens, and produce a decent honey harvest and adopt all the hygiene and behavioural characteristics associated with healthy colonies. So our next year's honey harvest starts now with our sugar water.
Brilliant. And Conway, when's that?
13th of September.
13th of September.
The Conway Honey Fair, by order of Edward II, 1284.
Good man. He learnt.
He did indeed. It's a great place to go. Get loads of local honey, produced by local beekeepers. The best stuff you can get. Best stuff ever. Wonderful place.
So we're in September. Honey Fair.
13th of September. I'll be on the gate.
You'll be on the gate, throwing people in and out.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks and see how it's all going.
Yes, we'll start pushing the boat out then on the as we start to treat Varroa using the oxalic acid vapour treatments, as we're bringing our hives into order, as we're doing the housekeeping that's necessary.
So thank you very much, Barry. Thank you.
Great day. Thank you.
This is Sound Radio.